Hello, Philosophy 102. So last week we covered relevance fallacies, which we talked about fallacies in the first place, right? Fallacies are erroneous arguments or the product of erroneous reasoning. I got an interesting question from one student, which was, are fallacies ever okay? And I hope to emphasize to you guys, no, they're never okay. Erroneous means containing errors. So we never want our reasoning to contain errors. We talked a bit about rhetoric and those sorts of things, and I said rhetoric was, okay sometimes to make your writing interesting or good. Hopefully not the illicit rhetorical devices we talked about in this class. But fallacies are different. You never want to be committing fallacies. So I just wanted to get that out of the way because I thought that was a really great question, right? Some of the things we talk about have better or worse applications. Fallacies are terrible and you should never commit fallacies, right? They fundamentally contain errors in reasoning. So the errors of chapter 6 focused on relevance, right? They introduced some sort of irrelevant information into the situation, into the issue, and thereby came to an erroneous conclusion. Now, the conclusions of fallacies can be true. They're not always necessarily incorrect. The problem is with the reasoning. You can't reason from the information given to the conclusion that is being purported or claimed, right? So whereas last week those fallacies all centered around the idea of irrelevant information somehow, right? Personal information, personal attacks. I can't list the rest off the top of my head. Personal information, personal attacks, mischaracterizations of your opponent's arguments, which were straw men, right? False dilemma, which is an either-or situation. So there, they missed a lot of relevant information. In this chapter, we're going to be focusing on induction fallacies. So these will contain relevant information, right? They may contain plenty of very relevant information, exactly the sort of relevant information that you want in order to make an inductive argument. But they're not going to be strong enough. The information is going to be so weak, or the evidence offered is going to be problematic in one way or another. So these are errors or failures of inductive reasoning. So we talked earlier in the semester about inductive and deductive arguments, and I emphasized that we really needed to get these ideas clear in our head because we would keep revisiting them, right? At that point, we were just kind of establishing a common vocabulary so we could talk about these things later. So if you recall correctly, as I hope you do, inductive arguments are more scientific. They're probabilistic. We collect a body of evidence and we come to a conclusion that is not absolutely 100% proof positive certain, but we hope it's more likely based on the evidence we've gathered. The other feature of inductive arguments you'll remember is we can add to our body of evidence, add to our premises to make the conclusion more likely. Or if we're offering a counter-argument, we can offer counter-evidence to make that conclusion less likely. So induction fallacies, it's really important to keep this central in your mind. The kind of evidence they offer is just not going to be appropriate. So it's going to fail for one reason or another. And that's what all these fallacies will have in common. So let's scroll down a little bit. I'm going to talk about generalizing, right? Because that's kind of what we're doing with inductive reasoning. We're collecting a bunch of specific individual bits of evidence and adding them together to form a conclusion about a specific situation, right? So generalizing is kind of built into inductive reasoning. We're going to look at the ways that can go wrong, right? Obviously, weak analogies. We talked about rhetorical analogies a few weeks ago, so we're kind of revisiting problems that we can get with analogies, problems with citing authorities, right? I've had a lot of students ask, what if authorities disagree on things? When I say authorities, I don't mean like cops or like politicians. I mean authorities in a field of study, right? So I am an authority on critical thinking. So that's how we're using that word here. I'm going to talk about popular beliefs and customs and cause and effect claims. These are really fun. We'll talk about the slippery slope arguments that we encounter quite often in like media. Those are very interesting. I'm sure some of you are already familiar with those, but please stick through until the end because we're going to be approaching it a little more rigorously than you may have in the past. And we will talk about fallacies involving untestable explanations, where the conclusion that is drawn or the argument that is given is even theoretically untestable. We couldn't test it if we wanted to. So think of a claim about alternate universes or alternate realities. Right now, given where science is, we can't even theoretically test a lot of those claims. So that sort of thing. All right, I think we are ready to go. I think the first thing we probably want to put in our notes is a definition for fallacies of induction or inductive fallacies. They're just arguments that are supposed to raise the probability of their conclusions, but are so weak as to fail almost entirely to do so, right? And this is why I keep coming back to this idea that we should understand what inductive and deductive arguments are supposed to do, right? Inductive arguments are supposed to raise the probability of their conclusions. They become fallacious when they are so weak as to fail almost entirely to do so, right? Yes, let's move on. It is worth noting we will revisit inductive reasoning done correctly when we get to Chapter 7. But you don't need to read, or Chapter 11, I'm sorry, we're on 7. We don't need to read Chapter 11 to understand why this reasoning is fallacious. So again, we'll learn how to do it right after we discuss how not to do it. So let's talk about generalizations. I quite like this one. The food in LA is lousy, right? So that's a general claim, right? We make these kinds of claims all the time. I think the food in LA is great. That's also a very general claim, right? But what if I had only ever gone to one restaurant in Los Angeles and I then made the claim the food in LA is lousy? I would be generalizing from one specific example. And I think we all would recognize that I didn't have good grounds to draw this conclusion that the food in LA is lousy, not from one sample. In fact, I think it'd probably take more time and meals than a person has in a lifetime to make a claim like the food in LA is lousy. The point is, we have a kind of general standard for evidence when we make these general claims, right? More than one, maybe fewer than 1,000, somewhere in there. We want a good sample size, which brings us to our first fallacy. So the first fallacy we are going to be looking at is the hasty generalization. I effectively made a hasty generalization when discussing the food in LA. So let's add that to our notes. Okay. So arriving at a general statement or rule by citing too few supporting cases, right? We don't want to say the food in Los Angeles is lousy based on one meal. Maybe a little more pertinent example of this would be with, a virus. We wouldn't want to say that it was deadly to most people if only one person had ever died from it, right? I'm not saying at all that that's what happened, but this can be more relevant than just making a generalization about the food in Los Angeles, right? We need to cite quite a few supporting cases to get to a general rule. So let's get the example we used, why is that green? The example we used earlier in our notes, right? The food in LA is lousy, judging from this meal. And if you want to be a little more clear about it, we can put this one meal in there. And this is obviously just an overgeneralization. We can generalize. Again, I want to emphasize generalization in and of itself is not problematic. It's problematic when you have too few supporting cases. Let's underline that. All right, wonderful. Okay, so this is strange. Assuming the speaker is dining at a restaurant, he or she has made a sweeping generalization about food sold at restaurants in a very large city based on his or her experience at this one restaurant. Right? I don't agree with this next statement that the support is so weak as to count as non-existent. It's just one data point. It doesn't cease to exist, but it might as well, I think, is what they're trying to say, right? And we all know not to make these sorts of generalizations. If you're a Democrat and you interact with one Republican, or maybe just the Republicans in your family, or vice versa, if you're a Republican, you interact only with, your parents who are Democrats, and then you try to say, all Democrats or all Republicans are lousy. Or just feel that way because they're concerned about their taxes or something, you're generalizing from too small of a sample. Don't do that. This is just a cute fact. This fallacy is sometimes called the fallacy of the lonely fact, which might help you to remember it. We can put that in our notes if we want to. I'll never figure out why it does that. I suppose that's on a different line in the PDF, so it's trying to keep its formatting. Okay. I don't want to spend too much time on this fallacy because I think it's pretty straightforward, right? Statements like, the police stopped me for driving 5 miles over the speed limit. Around here, they'll stop you for everything, right? It's a lonely fact. It's insufficient for thinking the police will stop everyone for every infraction. There's one specific form that I want to talk about, and you don't need to have this name in your notes, although it may help you with the extra credit, so might be worth putting in there. Argument by anecdote. Right? So an anecdote is just a single story, and these are quite common. So I do want to take a look at them. Let's look at this one. Did you read where John Travolta flew his plane into LAX and parked it on the tarmac, right there in everyone's way? That's the trouble with these Hollywood actors. They don't care about anyone but themselves, right? It's important to recognize that this is a story about John Travolta. And it's never going to be more than a story about John Travolta. In fact, it's one thing that John Travolta did. And we're also missing some other information. So generalizing from that story to all Hollywood actors is a fallacy. This becomes problematic largely, I've noticed, and I want to take a moment to talk about this, when people are arguing with you or trying to persuade you to their point of view, and they offer you one single personal story. And while that might be enough to persuade them, it shouldn't be enough to persuade you. It is just one single anecdote. So if somebody told me that they personally had chased a leprechaun around the Highlands or something like that, I'm not personally inclined to try to persuade them that they did not have this experience. But I also need to recognize that out of the billions and billions of people in the world and the multitude of experiences we have over the course of our lives, For existence claims, it's going to take more than one anecdote, one piece of evidence from one person that I have no direct access to investigate or interrogate before I accept that that leprechauns exist and that somebody did indeed chase one all over the Highlands, right? This kind of came up a bit. I think most of your instincts have this, or most of you have this instinct, because when we talked about the homework for the credibility of claims, you'll recall the story about someone's aunt who had a strange experience and concluded from that there were flying saucers. And most of you were prepared to accept that something had happened to this woman, but that single anecdote, right, that single story was not enough to persuade you that aliens existed. And that's really because this is fundamentally built into our critical capacity with engaging in information. We understand that one story is not enough. One anecdote is not enough. A lonely fact is just a single lonely fact. But we can be persuaded when they're less fantastical stories like this, right? And we have that cognitive bias. We have belief bias. So if the conclusion is something that we kind of already want to believe, right? In this case, Hollywood actors don't care about anyone but themselves. The combination of that cognitive bias and the fact that this is a non-extraordinary sort of event and claim might persuade us that this is a good argument. It's not. It is a hasty generalization. It's probably worth noting that these arguments by anecdote, which are a type of hasty generalization, are often used to try to disprove a kind of general claim, right? So you have this broad general claim for which there may or may not be a lot of evidence, but it is generally an accepted general claim. I just said generally twice in the sentence. It is usually an accepted general claim, and there's this one story up against it. So I do want to talk about this example as well. They say that the unemployment rate is around 8%, but I don't buy that at all. Anybody who wants a job can get one. You just have to be willing to settle for something less than ideal. When my husband was laid off, he didn't sit around crying about it. He got a job with a yard service. It didn't pay much, but you know what? He learned the ropes, and now he owns his own little yard service and hires several employees. So great, right? Like, that's fantastic that that happened for this person's husband. Very happy for him. However, this one situation does not disprove that the unemployment rate is around 8%. It simply cannot, right? This is a statistic that is the product of mountains of evidence, entire mountain ranges of evidence, right? And we have this one sad, well, it's not a sad story in this case, but we have this one lonely little fact. We have this one anecdote that really should not persuade you to reject the mountain of evidence for the initial claim. Okay, I believe we're ready to move on. Our first real subcategory of the hasty generalization is generalizing from exceptional cases. So we're going to put this in our notes. For some reason, they're the same color now. Who knows why that happened? So I'm just going to indent these subcategories for you guys. Okay, so this is arriving at a general statement or rule by citing an atypical supporting case. Right, so it's exceptional. That doesn't mean exceptionally good or exceptionally bad. It just means exceptional. You guys might have heard the exception that proves the rule. That drives me absolutely crazy. Okay, there's no such thing. All right. Let's look at this example. The police aren't required to get a search warrant if they arrest a suspect while a robbery is in progress and search him for a weapon. Therefore, they shouldn't be required to get a search warrant for any kind of search. Right? So this speaker is generalizing about all police searches from a premise about searches in exceptional circumstances. Right? We can see that that's an exceptional circumstance. This one's less obvious than the next one, the one I'd like to use for our example. So I have a friend who this is a real study. This is real information, and I have a friend who was fasting after a traumatic head injury because of this data. He's a very clever person. He has a master's degree in engineering, and he fell victim to this. So let's look at this. Let's use this as our example. Animals will live longer if they are on a calorie-restricted diet. This has been shown in experiments with rats. Do you guys know what my response to my friend was? Said, well, are you a rat? And I just missed the memo, right? Which is, he didn't like that at all. Okay, let's go. So, rats may have unusual responses to calorie-restricted diets. Yes, what holds for rats might hold for other animals, especially other mammals, maybe. So the argument does offer some support for its conclusion. Let's not be too judgmental of my friend, right? There is some support for this conclusion. But the conclusion overstates things. That animals will live longer on calorie-restricted diets has not been shown by the experiments, right? So let's really hone in on this claim. Animals will live longer if they are on a calorie-restricted diet. We cannot draw that conclusion based on experiments with rats, right? Animals are vastly different. They could have unusual responses, right? It is an entirely different biological organism. It is an exception, right? Or it could be an exception. There are lots of exceptions. Meaning simply that all animals are different and have exceptional things about them, right? Further testing is called for. We would want to test this with lots of other animals. We need more data. The next fallacy we're looking at is accident. So let's get that in our notes. Help if I could take decent notes for you guys. Or help you take decent notes. Okay, so this occurs when a speaker or writer assumes that a general statement automatically applies to a specific case that is or could well be exceptional. So I'm actually going to use a different example for this because I found this all over the place. I found it on Facebook, I found it on Twitter, I found it in news articles, I have found it in press releases from the current president. So, as many of you know, Donald Trump was recently diagnosed with coronavirus, with COVID-19. And he is in his 70s and he is overweight, which makes him within the demographic of at risk. However, the president is an exceptional case. He had exceptional access to early testing, regular testing, right, at a far greater interval than you or I would have it. And additionally, he had exceptional access to treatment, right? From the doctors who treated him right down to the treatments he received. A lot of these are not available for you or I. So what I saw being claimed was that his survival or his outcomes, the outcome of him having this virus, should be looked at as a sort of test case or should be used as evidence about the actual risk of this virus, right? So they attempted, I mean, I suppose we could say that was also generalizing from exceptional cases, right? Depending on which way you went with this argument. Accident goes in one direction, right? It assumes that a general statement automatically applies to a specific case. So if you were of the position, for example, I'm going to type this up and then we'll be right back. So I have typed up something like the claims I saw broadly in the media and on social media. COVID-19 is often fatal to people over the age of 70 who are medically overweight. I've italicized that because it's a medical classification. Therefore, President Trump is in great danger. Well, so what we have here is a general statement that has been erroneously, right, this is a general statement, erroneously applied to an exceptional case. Right? I kind of want to give the converse of this, which is generalizing from exceptional cases, just to round this out. So we'll be back with an example of that in a moment. So we've typed up an example here of generalizing from exceptional cases, or in this case, one exceptional case, which is a kind of hasty generalization. Maybe I should scroll up so we can see how this is organized. Okay. President Trump had COVID-19, is over 70 years old, and is overweight. Yet, he was not seriously ill. Right? That's our premise. And then the conclusion, therefore, COVID-19 is not likely to be fatal to other people who are over 70 years old and overweight. Right? Clearly, we are generalizing from an exceptional case. Right? Again, because he had exceptional access to early testing, exceptional access to treatment, and to physicians. So this is an exceptional case that we are using as, or certainly atypical, right? This is our supporting case, and we have generalized to the the general population, which does not have access to the same things that make Trump's case exceptional. This is fallacious. Both of these are fallacious. You might note that we saw both of these on both sides of the political aisle. Well, we saw one on one side, the other on the other side of the political aisle. I was nobody's friend while this was going on, because the fact of the matter is, it's just a bad idea to use exceptional cases to make any kind of generalized statement, right? To make any sort of inductive argument. We do not want to be using exceptional cases. Nor do we want to be applying general statements to exceptional cases. They just don't go together. We cannot draw these kinds of conclusions from exceptional information, or we cannot draw conclusions from general information about exceptional cases. I cannot stress enough how important this is, especially right now, especially now that we're all becoming more literate with statistics and data, because it affects our lives personally. Okay, that's enough of a rant. Time to move on. The next fallacy we're going to be looking at is the weak analogy. Hopefully, you guys remember our definition of analogy from when we did rhetorical analogies. If not, now is a good time to check your notes. But let's get this in our notes. So you have a weak analogy. What is that? And again, sometimes these are called false analogies. This can be very helpful, these adjectives on the front of fallacies, because analogies are fine. What we don't want is an analogy that doesn't work, right? I believe I mentioned this when we talked about the homework with regard to Ted Cruz and Dianne Feinstein from last chapter. Weak analogies are arguments based on debatable or unimportant similarities between two or more things. So what they mean by this, well, what they mean by debatable is they're contentious, right? It's not clear whether or not these things actually have those similarities. So let's put this in our notes. Where are we? There we are. I think we can probably get rid of weak, right? It already says weak. So it's a fallacious argument based on debatable or unimportant similarities between two or more things. We've got a really silly example first, right? My mom is just like Adolf Hitler. Don't say that about your mom, guys. Unless she is. I doubt she'll let me go out with you guys. So the speaker here has come to a conclusion based on this weak analogy. Just like the analogies we talked about before, there are easy ways to spot them, right? We can see that an analogy is being drawn is just like, which is to say they are similar. Sorry, I highlighted is first. I don't know why I did that. It very nearly goes without saying. Well, let's do this correctly. The speaker offers an analogy between her mom and Adolf Hitler, presumably to support the contention that she is a ruthless dictator who won't allow her daughter to do something with us. They've gendered the speaker here. Okay, anyway, it should go without saying that the similarities between Adolf Hitler and her mother, if there are any, are almost certainly superficial. Right? This is not a meaningful comparison. So, weak analogy, right? We can't reasonably come to this conclusion. That analogy shouldn't have been made at all. I find this one quite silly, though. There's a much better example for our notes right here. The federal government is just like a private household. If it doesn't balance its budget, it will go bankrupt. Right? Is the federal government just like a household? Is that really the case? I'm going to give you guys a pro tip. It's not the case. It's not. This argument likens the federal government to a household like yours or mine to support the idea that the federal government will go bankrupt if it doesn't balance its budget. So why is this analogy weak? The analogy is weak because the federal government has ways of avoiding bankruptcy indefinitely that are not available to a private household. These include being able to raise taxes, print money, and stimulate economic growth and foreign investment. Right? You and I cannot do these things. So there's a relevant way in which the federal government is profoundly dissimilar to a private household, specifically with regard to the economy. Or to its budget. So that analogy should not have been drawn. It was weak. The very thing that it was trying to prove is one of the things where it is most dissimilar, or it's a thing that is very obviously fundamentally dissimilar because private households do not have access to very relevant features of the question of bankruptcy. Sorry, it's hard to word that. But yes, obviously we don't have those solutions to bankruptcy. So there are a few other examples of weak analogies, but I don't want to spend too long on them. I did notice, however, while looking at this, that the same friend who was trying to use rat science to justify his eating habits also falls victim to a similar argument to this. Maybe I need to have a chat with him. In the wild, wolves eat nothing but raw meat. Therefore, we should feed our dog nothing but raw meat. So the conclusion may be true, but this argument is weak support. Right? Canine digestive systems may have evolved differently from wolves. And again, this is a real thing, and there's a citation here for it if you guys want to investigate it. The reason I wanted to take a moment with this one is because there are human diets that use a very weak analogy as well that are quite similar to this. They appeal to the conditions of human evolution and then suggest that we should continue those, when in reality our lives are extremely disanalogous to those of humans 150 to 200,000 years ago. And those dissimilarities are significant enough that the analogy is very weak support. So there's an interesting one here about global warming, but I'm going to move on. So this next one is among my favorite fallacies, and that's kind of because a lot of people know about it, but they really get it wrong. When people try to find this one in nature, they really seem to misunderstand the essence of this fallacy and what's going wrong with the reasoning. So we're going to take a moment with that. It's called mistaken appeal to authority. Sometimes it's called false appeal to authority. And sometimes it's just called appeal to authority, and that's where the problematic thinking comes in, I've found. So let's get this in our notes. So a mistaken appeal to authority. What is that? It's when someone tries to support a contention by offering as evidence the opinion of a non-authoritative source. So let's make this a little more grammatical. So I would just say it's an argument that supports a contention, which again is just a claim, by offering as evidence the opinion of a non-authoritative source, which apparently my computer does not like. Oh, we can just hyphenate it. Okay, excellent. So this is the tricky part of this fallacy. Sometimes we will appeal to authorities on things. If somebody asked you, why do you think that's the correct definition of this fallacy? Hopefully you would say, well, because my textbook and my philosophy professor told me that was the correct definition. That would be an appeal to authority. You would be appealing to an authority on the subject. The problem arises when we use a non-authoritative source, right? So let's just get an example in here, and we'll be able to talk about this a bit more clearly. My father thinks the president lied, therefore the president lied. The fact that it's one's father who thinks the president lied does not affect the probability that he did, unless, of course, the subject is something the father would have special knowledge about, right? So one's father may certainly well be an authority figure in one's life, and they may have special authority in regard to things that they do have special knowledge of. However, accepting situations where that special knowledge is, the president lied directly to them or something like that, or to him, I suppose I should say, his authority doesn't translate to an authority over this claim. It is outside his domain of authority, as it were. So I quite like this other example. I think it's a bit better. My doctor thinks my car has leaking valves, therefore my car has leaking valves. I like this because all these examples are actual authority figures, right? If your doctor told you that you had a heart condition, for example, you would believe them. And that's because they are an authoritative source on your health, right? But they are not a mechanic. They are not an authoritative source on your car, right? So that's why I really want to emphasize, this is not just any appeal to authority. Appeals to authority are fine. It's the legitimacy of the authority that's in question, right? Are they an authority on the issue being discussed or the issue at hand? Everything else being equal, that your doctor thinks you have leaking heart valves raises the probability that you do. But everything else being equal, that your doctor thinks your car has leaking engine valves does not raise the probability that it does, unless he's also a mechanic or something like that. So, and again, of course, well, not again, of course, special circumstances can diminish a physician's authoritativeness in regard to medical conditions too, just as special circumstances can dismiss any expert's authoritativeness within his or her sphere of expertise. Right? Yeah, let's just continue with this. I think it makes the point just as well as I could. One of the most common occurrences of mistaken appeal to authority occurs when an authority in one field, domain, or discipline is assumed without further ado to be an authority in an unrelated field, domain, or discipline. We're very charitable with our authority figures, right? But if you were to ask your physician, for example, about the morality of a surgery, I would go so far as to say they are not an authority on ethics. They are an authority on the functions, the proper function of the human body, not on what is right and wrong. Ultimately, if those are your values, you are kind of the only authority on that. Although I might argue that a philosopher, an ethicist, could also become an authority on ethical issues. Maybe a judge, right? We shouldn't let this kind of cross-disciplinary authority happen for no good reason. I think it's a big problem. And I think that's also why our textbook chooses for its examples two places where somebody extends their authority well beyond their appropriate domain. Again, mistaken appeal to authority isn't any appeal to authority. It's when it is a mistake in whether or not that person is actually an authority on the subject. Please do not call out people who appeal to authorities as committing some kind of fallacy. That is exactly the sort of thing we want to do. Well, we want to appeal to authorities appropriately within their domains to make their arguments. I cannot stress this enough. Moving right along, our next fallacy is way easier. It's hard to miss this one. Students generally like this one. So we've got mistaken appeal to popularity. What is mistaken appeal to popularity? It happens when a speaker or writer treats an issue that cannot be settled by public opinion as if it can. So let's just get that speaker or writer out of there and put the remainder in our notes. So we talked a little about this when we talked about objective and subjective claims, right? Subjective claims can quite often be settled by something like public opinion. Whereas objective claims, it doesn't matter. We could take a vote and ask everybody what they thought about them, and it's still, even if 100% of people agreed, if 100% of people agreed that, well, let's say 100% of Americans agreed that China didn't exist, that would not cause China to cease to exist, right? It simply is not a matter that can be settled by public opinion. All right, let's get ourselves an example. The Iranians have nuclear weapons. Everyone knows that. Even if you had a way of telling that what everyone thinks on a subject, and even if everyone believed the claim in question, the argument does not provide much support for it, right? We would have to locate those nuclear weapons, right? That's an objective fact. Everyone feeling a way about it doesn't change it at all. So I prefer this one for our example. Almost everyone knows that plastic is contaminating the oceans, therefore plastic is contaminating the oceans. Yes, I didn't need to space down so much. Yes, I did. Okay. Right. I prefer this one because the evidence does seem to show that plastic is indeed contaminating our oceans. So again, this one kind of plays with our cognitive biases, specifically with regard to belief bias. You might find yourself making arguments like this about things that are indeed, the conclusions of which are indeed true, right? But this is very bad evidence for the truth of this. In fact, it is not even evidence for the truth of the conclusion. I would say they're unrelated, but they're not, because we're not in relevance fallacies anymore. It's simply not the kind of evidence that we would use to come to a conclusion like this. We would look for evidence of plastic contaminating the oceans. We're not going to take a vote on it. I think that's enough for mistaken appeal to popularity. I lied a little bit there. We have a little more to say about mistaken appeal to popularity, because I think this is helpful. Ask yourself, I don't know why that's capitalized. Oh, typo. Anyway, ask yourself, would a scientist writing in a scientific journal offer popular opinion as evidence of something's truth or falsity? If not, then you would commit the mistaken appeal to popularity if you did. So, again, it's a rule of thumb. It won't help in every case, but it will help in the more egregious instances. So, we're going to skip a little bit through the textbook to our next fallacy. So, we've entered a section that the textbook has titled Fallacies Related to Cause and Effect. I'm not going to put this big thing in our notes. Instead, we're just going to focus in on two fallacies related to cause and effect. It's important to recognize that simply because two things occurred temporally in relation to each other does not mean that one caused the other. But this is how we inductively reason. We see one event followed by another event, and we tend to think, especially if we see it over and over and over again, we tend to think that those events caused one another, or that one was caused by the other. It's not always wrong to look at causal relationships, but the way these fallacies occur is lack of causal evidence, let's call it. So the first one we're looking at is just full on in Latin, post hoc ergo propter hoc. It just means after this, therefore because of it. What even happened there? There we go. Okay. Actually, let's put that in parentheses. And you're like, but that's exactly what cause is, right? No, wrong. So it means after this, therefore because of it. A speaker or writer commits this fallacy when he or she assumes that the fact that one event came after another establishes that it was caused by the other. There are more easy examples, but the example I'm going to insist that we use is morally relevant to me, and it's important to me that you guys learn how to reason about these sorts of things. So, after I took Zicam, my cold went away fast. Therefore, taking Zicam caused my cold to go away fast. Some of you are like, wait, I see Zicam in the store. I've used Zicam. I've had this experience. Well, if this is your reasoning, then you have indeed committed a fallacy. The speaker makes a mistake to assume that Zicam caused the cold to go away fast. Right? There's actually no good evidence that Zicam or other homeopathic or naturalistic remedies have any causal relationship to one's health. Zero evidence for it. In fact, there's pretty strong evidence against it. What's happened here is that two things have happened consecutively, and we have incorrectly attributed causal power to the first event. I'm sure also after you drank a bunch of water, your cold went away quickly, right? Or after you went to sleep, your cold went away quickly. So it is a bit odd that we would point to this medication. This is why we want to be suspicious. Also, just worth noting, I feel like I'm doing my ethical duty here, all things that are sold as remedies or alternative medicine, they categorically have not been proven to work in any kind of research. There's a funny joke. Do you know what we call? I forget the. I'm forgetting the name of it because I just call it like quackery. What do we call? It's not non-standard medicine, non-traditional medicine. If it works, well, we call it medicine, right? So all of these alternative medicine, that was the word I was looking for. What do we call alternative medicine that works? We just call it medicine. So it's a funny joke, but it's also true. Any of these things that are marketed as remedies, there's absolutely no good scientific evidence for them. They rely usually on this kind of post hoc, ergo propter hoc, fallacious reasoning. And they make quite a bit of money off of it. So hopefully you guys will stop them from being rich from promoting bad thinking. Okay, so, here's a great example of why it doesn't work. After I played poker, my cold went away fast. Therefore, playing poker caused my cold to go away fast. Right? You wouldn't say this, and there's no more reason to make the second claim than there is to make the first, right? Mere temporal relationships. Temporal means in time. Sorry if I keep saying that. But mere relationships in time do not establish cause and effect. So let's look at one much more obviously problematic one. Every day the sun comes up after the rooster crows. Therefore, the rooster caused the sun to come up. So there's a chance you're thinking, well, no, they've got it exactly backwards. The sun coming up caused the rooster to crow. That's not the same as what I was thinking about Zicam. Well, maybe you only take Zicam when you get colds and you naturally have a healthy immune system, right? So it would then happen, if your cold causes you to take Zicam, that every time you take Zicam, your cold would go away, right? These are, in fact, the same sort of fallacious reasoning. Okay, let's move on to our next causal fallacy. So we're looking at Cum Hoc, Ergo Propter Hoc, which literally just means with this, therefore, because of it in Latin. And this fallacy is essentially the same as post hoc. On our exams, we will just lump these two together. They can be quite difficult to tell apart. So don't stress it too much. So we commit this fallacy when we assume that the fact that two events happen at about the same time establishes that one caused the other. And let's get a really quick example in here. But again, Cum Hoc and post hoc are problematic for the same reasons. So I don't feel the need to dwell on this too much, and we'll talk generally about these causal fallacies more once we're done. So John had a heart attack while he was saying a prayer. Therefore, the prayer caused his heart attack. So, oh no, that's my recording software. Would you open? Thank you. Okay. It may be worth noting that Cum Hoc usually involves exceptional circumstances, like having a heart attack and saying a prayer, right? Let's talk about this very briefly. The fact that two unusual events happen at the same time can be a reason for thinking that one might have caused the other. But this is never sufficient to establish that this happened, as the speaker in the previous example implies, right? So we don't even have two unusual events here. I'm assuming that John prays pretty regularly. And the heart attack is really the only unusual event. So if you imagine how frequently John says prayers and how rarely, when saying prayers, he has heart attacks, it's kind of not surprising at all that the heart attack might have occurred while he was saying a prayer. This example is maybe a little more reasonable or easy to understand. Children with long hair are better spellers than children with short hair. Therefore, having long hair makes the child a better speller. So, right, the conclusion does not follow from this. This appears to me to just be mere coincidence. If we had a premise like this. Okay, so now I want to move on to talking about these sorts of fallacies more broadly. So in our notes, I've written causal fallacies broadly. I cannot stress enough, this does not say casual, it says causal. You may have causal papers assigned to you in your English classes. That does not mean casual. It means with regard to cause and effect. With regard to cause and effect, the kind of important rule to remember is that correlation does not prove causation, right? Correlation meaning that these two events happen together or have happened together in the past or happen at the same time, right? So I'm going to be lumping Cum Hoc and Post Hoc together in this one. So if I say at the same time or one after the other, we can just assume that that's not particularly pertinent. So we're told that cause and effect, I mean, how when you really think about it, how else could you prove that one thing causes another but for the fact that they always happen together? Philosopher David Hume did some incredible work on this that if anyone's interested in, I would love to share. It's a bit outside of the scope of this class, I think, but it really revolutionized philosophic thinking and scientific thinking, and it is based fundamentally on science when we talk about cause and effect. It's also fundamentally linked to the idea of induction itself. Because what do we get from the world but the impression of one thing causing another thing, causing another thing, causing another thing, or one thing causing another thing reliably, right? Over and over and over again in our lives. I'm hungry, so I go eat, and that causes me not to be hungry anymore. And this is kind of a very scientific description of the entirety of our lives. So causal reasoning is very important to us. It's not surprising that we're going to do it incorrectly sometimes, or that we see cause everywhere we look. It really is the entirety of our human experience. So what could be going wrong when we think we see cause and effect? Well, we could be overlooking the possibility of coincidence, right? So this says post hoc, but again, this works with Cum Hoc as well. So let's look at this example. After Susan threw out the chain letter, she was in an automobile accident. Therefore, throwing out the chain letter caused her to get in an automobile accident. So the speaker overlooked the possibility that the sequential events were coincidental. So this is one thing we want to keep in mind when we're doing causal reasoning. Could it be a coincidence, right? Maybe I should just, I think we're fine with this. Don't overlook the possibility of coincidence. That is an important thing to ask yourself when two events happen one after the other or together. This is one that I like much more, overlooking a possible common cause. And I think the example of this is quite fun, but let's get this in our notes. So, I left the lights on when I went to bed. The next morning, I woke up with a headache. Therefore, leaving the lights on caused the headache. Right? What's a possible common cause you guys can think of? So, I like their example a lot. The speaker has overlooked the possibility that leaving the lights on and waking up with a headache may each be effects of a common cause, such as having gone to bed unusually tired or intoxicated, right? Being very tired or being drunk could cause you to leave the lights on, and it could cause you to have a headache, right? So that's overlooking a possible common cause. Instead, we just attribute cause and effect to these two things that in reality have a further back common cause. So, random variation is a tricky one to understand, but it is used in advertising a lot. So let's get this in our notes. And you all are free to provide examples for yourselves or read more into this. But I think just having this list, these should be fairly easy to remember. Okay, so how does this get used in advertising? I'm just going to skip directly to the example. So you may have seen a commercial advertising like copper bracelets, or for a while they were these like silicon bracelets with like a hologram in them, those sorts of like infomercial type things. They'll make claims like this. In our test, we asked randomly selected men to drive a golf ball as far as they could. When we had them wear our magnetic bracelet and try again, we then had them wear. I'm so glad I'm terrible at reading these lousy advertisements. We then had them wear our magnetic bracelet and try again. On the second occasion, the men hit the ball an average of 10 feet further. Our bracelet can lengthen your drive as well, right? So the speaker here is, well, I'd say they're doing more than implying. They're outright stating that the magnetic bracelet caused the improvement in the average drive lengths. However, the improvement might simply have been due to random variation, right? Random variation has to do with random variation in performance, right? So here's some actual examples, and I realize I did this in a strange order, but I wanted an example to talk about as we discuss this one. For example, well, actually, maybe I should read the thing first. Random variation occurs when we ignore the fact that values of variables fluctuate randomly. It just happens. I perform differently every time I go mountain climbing, right? Within a certain range. So if you have any task you can think of that you do regularly, your performance is going to fluctuate a bit. So, for example, the average distance that one randomly selected group of men can throw a football will vary randomly from the average distance another randomly selected group of men can throw a football. Likewise, the average distance a randomly selected group of men can throw a football will vary randomly from the average distance the same group of men can throw a football on a second try. With certain things, some of these like little gimmicky bracelets and stuff, they'll have you like hold it in your hand and then like press on your arm. With those sorts of balance tests, which these people give you the impression, or during their demonstrations, they attribute the strength you gain the second time to the bracelet or the little gadget or gizmo they've given you to hold on to. But the fact is, we actually get significantly better at stretching and balancing on our second try. You can test this out at home. Try to touch your toes really hard, stand up, and then go back and try a second time, and you will almost always be able to stretch further on the second try. That's why it's called stretching. The same applies to balance. You can do this with a family member, maybe, but have them hold an arm out, just like they do with those silly little tests, and push down on their arm and ask them to resist, and then give them, I don't know, a bottle cap or something to hold and tell them it's a magic bottle cap, and try to press down on their arm again, and you will find it is significantly more difficult the second time. That's because our brain, even in that brief moment, has learned something about balancing and resisting. So that's not even random variation, that's predicted variation. I bring it up because I find these gimmicks to be absolutely insidious, and they usually prey on people who have health issues. So that's not cool. But anyway, that's overlooking the possibility of random variation. With these ones where they claim to do tests, they will quite often they'll dispose of information that doesn't confirm the hypothesis that they wanted, or the efficacy of their gadget or gizmo. Okay, so I believe that is all we have in this section, but I do want to talk about a little more about cause and effect. So, last but not least, we have overlooking the possibility of reversed causation. And this definitely applies more to Cum Hoc than it does to post hoc, but just like with the example of taking Zicam because you have a cold, and then coming to believe that the Zicam cured the cold, instead of just noticing that, well, every time I have a cold, I engage in the same behavior. It's not really reverse causation, but we can improperly attribute cause and effect in this other way. But again, it applies way more to Cum Hoc than it does post hoc, because future events can't cause past events. That should be obvious to you guys. Sorry, time travel isn't really a thing. So sometimes the speaker or writer commits the Cum Hoc fallacy, or commits the Cum Hoc fallacy, is guilty of overlooking the possibility of reversed causation. So this example is great, and we're just going to talk about it briefly. People who walk long distances enjoy good health. Therefore, walking long distances will make you healthy. Seems reasonable, right? The speaker has assumed that the walking accounts for the good health, but maybe he or she has it backward. Maybe being healthy accounts for the walking, right? If you're not healthy, you're not going to want to go out for these long walks. So, one more example. Successful business people often drive expensive cars. Therefore, driving an expensive car will help make you a successful business person. Don't fall for this fake it till you make it stuff, you guys, please. This speaker has overlooked the possibility that driving an expensive car is the result of being successful, not the cause of it, right? Do not fake it until you make it. That's a bad strategy. Okay, let's move on. Our penultimate fallacy, penultimate is one of my favorite words. Our penultimate fallacy is the slippery slope fallacy. Now, if you guys have been looking for things to include in your extra credit, this should make you think of some advertisements. These happen all the time, and I miss the days of in-person teaching because people would get very excited and just shout them out. So, potential for your extra credit assignment here. So, when we commit the slippery slope, we create an argument that rests on an unsupported warning that is controversial or tendentious, to the effect that something will progress by degrees to an undesirable outcome. What on earth does that mean? That seems like a mess, right? Let's take a moment for it. Or let's break it down bit by bit. So it's an argument that rests on an unsupported warning, right? So don't do that, right, is a warning. Or you shouldn't do that thing. You shouldn't do X. Because if you do X, then maybe I should highlight this. Because if you do X, then Y and Z will naturally follow, right? Something will progress by degrees to an undesirable outcome. So all this is saying is, maybe I shouldn't have started with X. It's quite late in the alphabet, isn't it? If you do A, then B is going to happen, and then C is going to happen, and then D is going to happen, and then E, right on through to F, and that'll be terrible, right? That's the slippery slope fallacy. It's this kind of causal chain of one thing leading to another until something absolutely terrible has happened. The important part here is the part we skipped, actually. Well, we really didn't. It's an unsupported warning that is controversial or tendentious, right? Of course, well, not of course. If any of you go on to study philosophy later, I don't want you telling me I said of course. It seems obvious that one event may cause another. Don't put your hand in that fire because then you'll get burned, is not a slippery slope argument. Even if you made it this big long chain into this story, don't put your hand in the fire because then you'll get burned and we'll have to end our camping trip early and it's going to cost you thousands of dollars in medical bills and you may lose the use of your hand, right? So that is a chain of events. But nothing about that chain of events is controversial, right? So that is not a slippery slope argument, even though it does have one event causing another event causing another event. There's nothing controversial about those order of events. It becomes a slippery slope argument when the cause of one event, the alleged cause of one event, is not likely to lead at all to the subsequent event. I cannot stress this enough. A chain of events is not in and of itself a slippery slope. It has to be unclear that the first event, the event we're warned against undertaking, will lead to the alleged subsequent events. So let's get an example in here. So we've got this handy example right here. We should not require gun owners to carry liability insurance because if we do that, before long, they will repeal the Second Amendment. I have no idea what happened there. I don't like it, though. Okay. So here we're talking about carrying liability insurance, specifically with regard to gun owners. And somehow we've, started at the top of this slide and we've slid all the way to repealing the Second Amendment. Now, the trick with the slippery slope is it's not clear that what caused us to undertake the first action is at all applicable to the final stage of the slippery slope. So another example that, this just has to stop, this italics. Another example that you may have come across, and probably the older among us will remember this more so than my younger students, but if we allow gay people to marry, the next thing people will want to marry their cars and their dogs, right? Or something like that. I'm not trying to satirize people who make arguments similar to this. I just don't want to put in the effort of really typing out the whole list of events that they think will happen, and this is quite a good example. So what would cause us to allow gay people to marry? Well, something like a belief that consenting adults should be able to enter into consensual agreements with one another. That's usually what informs people's pro position on this issue, right? Some belief that no human being should be restricted in their capacities because of their sexuality, or something like that, right? Consenting adults should be able to do what they want amongst themselves. A belief something like that usually informs this position, or a desire to bring about marriage equality. Does that same reasoning apply to cars or dogs? Could it also cause us to allow people to marry their cars and their dogs? I don't think so, right? In fact, I really don't see how it could, right? Because we just have this belief about consenting adults. We don't have this belief about squirrels. We don't think squirrels should be able to marry each other. We're concerned with cognizant, consenting adults and human rights when we make a claim like this. That cause, the thing that would cause us to permit this, could not possibly be applicable in these other situations. Likewise, what would cause us to allow... Sorry, my computer glitched. As I was saying, what would cause us to require insurance to be carried by gun owners is highly unlikely to be applicable to repealing the Second Amendment. So it's an unsupported warning that is controversial, right? It's not clear at all that the cause of the first step is applicable to the second, third, fourth, or fifth steps in this causal chain. So there's nothing to cause us to slide down that slippery slope. So let's go back to the textbook. It words things a little differently than I do, but I think it's similar enough. The speaker has made a surprising and controversial statement. This is not like saying that if you run your air conditioning for 24 hours a day, your utility bill will go up, right? The causal relationship is controversial, as it were. All right, so I know there are quite a few advertisements that feature kind of absurdist humor, where, failing to buy a product leads to all sorts of cataclysmic events. Those are great examples of slippery slopes, and they're silly, but we need to recognize that they do happen in our political and moral reasoning as well. So, on to the ultimate, meaning the final fallacy in this chapter. I would like you to put this in your notes, but I usually do not include it on the midterm exam. So, this is called Untestable Explanation. This one is very worthwhile. I find that we actually tend to make these in our own reasoning more than we tend to find them out in the wild, which is why I think they're so important. So, when someone offers an explanation that could not be tested even in principle, right? So let's put that in our notes. So, what does this mean? Could not be tested even in principle. This is pretty heavy right here. You might start to notice these in certain disciplines. There's a really interesting philosophic distinction that comes into play here that I want to talk about very briefly. There's a philosopher named Karl Popper, and he was a philosopher of science. I'm a big fan of his. Not everybody is. And this is kind of what he discovered for us, as it were. Science requires testability. And this is a quote of his. If observation shows that the predicted effect is definitely absent, then the theory is simply refuted. Now, that sounds bad, right? What this is called is often falsifiability, right? It means that there is some way to test the theory and see if it is true or false. This is fundamental to what science is, and because we are in the chapter on inductive fallacies, this is especially relevant because induction and science are fundamentally intrinsically linked. So if we have an explanation that could not be tested even in principle, we would call that unfalsifiable, and that is not good. It is not good for a theory to be unfalsifiable. Karl Popper created two categories, two names for these. He said there was science and there was pseudoscience. Generally, we don't call this other category pseudoscience anymore because it's definitely not just completely made up, but we now refer to them as the soft sciences. If you've ever wondered why soft science is fundamentally different to actual science, or what the essence of that difference is, it's that soft sciences quite often offer untestable explanations. So within psychology, for example, Karl Popper used Sigmund Freud as his example. He said that, I'm trying to think of an example, men behaved the way they did because they had unaffectionate mothers. I think he called it like refrigerator mother syndrome or something like that, or that was the common name for it. Frigid mothers. They weren't given enough love or affection. If I produced an example of a man whose mother was unloving and unaffectionate, but who turned out perfectly healthy, instead of accepting that as evidence to the contrary of his theory, he would find some other account for it, right? That's the essence of this difference, right? Those claims, those causal claims, actually, about, oh, I had an uncomfortable childhood and that's why I am the way I am now. We can't really go about testing those things. We might try to offer evidence of people who had similar backgrounds as evidence to the contrary, but there's really no way to test that, not even in principle. And again, we've come a long way since Karl Popper. He was at the turn of the 20th century, or in the first half of the 20th century, and we no longer call these things pseudoscience anymore, and we've also come quite far since Freud, so we call them soft sciences, though, because they rely on these untestable explanations. Not all of them are going to be problematic, but I want to teach you guys how to recognize them when you see them. So let's get an example. And also, if you want more information about Karl Popper, please email me because he is wonderful. So I find this example just perfectly useful. He has had heart issues because of sins done in a previous life. Now, maybe we should, just for organization, put this right here. So he has heart issues because of sins done in a previous life. How could we test this to see if it was true? We couldn't, is the answer, right? This explanation is untestable. There's no way to tell if someone is a previous life sinner. We cannot even identify people who have had previous lives. Plus, who is to say that someone's past life was in a human form? Perhaps some of us had previous lives as bugs and such. We don't know if bugs are capable of sin, but we do know that we cannot distinguish a bug that has sinned from one that has not. So, this is a lighthearted analysis, but this is a preposterous explanation. If we wanted to investigate that, we couldn't. We talked a bit about this, again, in our credibility section with regard to Dr. Edith Fiore. I hope I'm saying her name right. I should probably look it up at some point. Okay, so also worth noting, some explanations are untestable because they're circular. They merely repackage themselves in alternative language. Right? This is not necessarily question begging, but it is strikingly similar. Right? Hooray, the kings are winning again. That's because they are gaining momentum. Right? This explanation is not quite as circular as saying the kings are winning because they're ahead. Still, it does basically just repeat itself using different words. One could not test it. The only way to identify a gain in momentum is to look at the scoreboard. So finally, some explanations are untestable because they are too vague. Here's a really great example, and we're also likely to encounter this sort of fallacy. The crime rate has gone up because of general moral decay. Right? This argument isn't circular. Moral decay, whatever it is not identical to a rising crime rate. Rather, the problem here is vagueness. We do not know what moral decay is exactly, so we don't know how to test the assertion. These are quite common. Sometimes I'll ask you guys for clarification of your questions because we all have a different framework for things like moral decay. Nobody has ever messaged me anything that specific, but we need to specify what we mean with these terms before we can even begin to analyze or test the assertion. So that is everything for inductive fallacies. Again, inductive reasoning is great, but it's fundamentally probabilistic. So this is a little less clear, right? Because we're just talking about probabilities, and that can range from 1% to 99.9%, right? Likely to happen or not happen. So we have this interesting balancing act where we ask ourselves, when does an analogy become weak? Or precisely, where do you draw the line between a credible authority and one who lacks credibility? Right? When does a report become a report and cease to be an anecdote? And exactly how controversial are the causal relationships in slippery slopes? It can be really difficult when we encounter these things in the wild. Hopefully everything we've talked about in this chapter was pretty clear to you. And it's important to recognize that just because you can't say exactly where the line is doesn't mean that there's not a line, right? This is called a problem of percissification, and some people have a problem with it and others don't. And I know you guys really want to study hard and do well, and I promise I won't try to play any tricks on you in the exams with our fallacies. But just keep in mind, it's this balancing act. Have they given enough evidence? Do we have 20 anecdotes together that add up to an actual study? Or maybe 5,000 anecdotes together that add up to a study. Where do we draw the line? Do you need 10? Do you need 15? Do you need 5,000? Do you need 100,000? Right? Just because there's not a clear line doesn't mean there's not a vast difference between an account that gives us one data point and an account that gives us 5,000 data points. So use your best judgments with these, and I hope some of you choose to use these in your extra credit assignment. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.